And we're live. Hi, everybody. I'm Ryan Schumacher. Welcome to Bible Geeks Week 3. We are covering the Sinai Covenant this week. This is a big one. There's a lot of stuff going on. And so we're going to break it up into multiple videos, at least two, maybe more, we'll find out. But I think this part right here is one of the most important parts for understanding the Old Testament. Uh, we looked at creation. We looked at the covenant with Abraham, and then we have the covenant with Sinai here. If you get these three things, the rest of the Old Testament is going to make sense to you. I promise. And so this one right here, though, this is the backdrop. If you were to do a timeline of the biblical history and then mark where the books are, Genesis would span really big. Genesis spans from creation all the way through to Joseph. Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy span about 40 years of time, give or take a little bit. There's a lot happening right here in this moment in history. So even though Genesis is one book, it covers a huge swath of time. Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy come back to back to back to back to back. Joshua and Judges too. Joshua, if you put that in there, that's only another couple of years, couple of decades. Then Judges starts to go longer than that. But so what's happening right now is rapid fire, and it represents the new relationship that Israel ends up in with God. And so we're going to go through that relationship right now. We're going to talk about, in particular, for this video, we're going to talk about the covenant structure. So we're going to go through the covenant offer, the terms of the covenant. We're going to go through the ratification of the covenant, the sign of the covenant, and then the end of it, the arrival of the Shekinah glory, which concludes the book of Exodus. Then there's going to be a separate video where we're going to spend some time in the law. I think this is something that there's a lot of questions about, especially in this day and age. And that if I'll share a story on that video too that I think is actually kind of interesting. But so let's go through these. We're going to start off with a previously on God's story. Some of these slides, I'm preaching this tomorrow, and so I'm reusing a lot of the slides. Some of this are things that make a lot of sense in context, at least at this point in time in our sermon series. But I'll explain the slides as we go along. But I think it's important, before we start the Sinai Covenant, we get two markers here. We got to look at the covenant with Abraham, and then we've got to look at the theophany with Moses, the burning bush. So these two things, I think, set the appropriate backdrop for the Sinai Covenant. So you have the covenant with Abraham. Remember, Genesis 12:3. All the peoples on earth will be blessed through you, through Abraham. So there's a promise that the blessing will return post-fall. Remember, there was in Eden, and the Genesis 1 and 2, God is walking with humans. They are in the right relationship with God. They've been given their vocation. They've been given their calling, and they're carrying that out until the fall. After the fall, that separation takes place. God is no longer dwelling with humans. We are no longer the priests in his garden, so to speak. The ruling and subduing vocation then goes to Noah. But, will that relationship be restored? Humans try in Babel. God says no. God comes to Abraham and says yes, and it's going to go through you. That's the only detail we get at that time in Genesis 12. The land is given as an eternal possession. This is going to be relevant to Israel coming out of Egypt, because in the covenant ratification in Genesis 15, remember, Abraham is told that his offspring are going to be enslaved in a foreign land for 400 years. And then they will return to the promised land. So those are just kind of three important markers for the covenant with Abraham. Now, fast forward just about 400 years later to the burning bush, Exodus 3. So this is Moses' call right here. So Moses sees a bush that's on fire, and it's not being consumed. He's like, I better go check that out. And then it turns out it's God. So God identifies himself in Exodus 3 as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So he is taking Moses back through the lineage, back through to Abraham, and identifying himself with the God that promised the land to them. And he's saying, I will rescue you out of Egypt and take you to the land of promise. So remember, Abraham was told, your offspring will be slaves for 400 years. Now God's appearing later and saying, okay, it's time. We're going to go to the promised land now. I'm going to take you out of Egypt. And then when you bring the people out of Egypt, you will worship God at this mountain. Remember, this is taking place at Mount Sinai. And then Yahweh delivers on his promises and brings them to Sinai. One thing that's not in the slides that I do want to go over a little bit is Passover. So the whole idea, this people that are being chosen and brought out, why this people? Why the idea of Israel as God's chosen people comes from Exodus. And the reason is they're the descendants of Abraham to whom God made the promise. These people right now actually have a covenant relationship with God because they are the sons of Abraham. And so when it's time for Passover, the first Passover, when they finally are able to get the Pharaoh to let them go, the family of Israel, the people of Israel, have been selected as God's family unconditionally. Their chosen status as God's people has nothing to do with them being good or bad or doing the right rituals or, however they acted up to that point. This promise was made to them vis-a-vis Abraham 4 centuries beforehand. So their status as God's chosen people, dare I say God's elect people, was predetermined before they were born, did anything good or bad. It's all about their covenant relationship with God. And so there was no requirement to be eligible to put the lamb's blood on the doorpost. It was just because you were a member of Israel, you did that. And so Israel is chosen unconditionally as God's people and brought out of Egypt, and then brought to Sinai. So we're about to see now in Exodus 19, this is where you see the covenant offer take place. This is going to be different than the other covenants. And if you've if you've watched the other videos, you'll already be kind of familiar with where this is going. But if you haven't, or, for the sake of a refresher, we'll go over it. So the covenant with Noah, Abraham, David, and the new covenant. These are called promissory covenants. God alone is the one that's making the promise in these covenants. Remember, with Abraham, God alone is the one that passes through the animals. Remember, those animals signify, if the one taking the oath breaks the covenant, then let what happened to these animals happen to me, the oath breaker. And we also discussed that covenants only end either by the sword or the shovel. So it's either the party that is oath bound dies, which won't happen with God, or the party that is oath bound breaks the covenant, in which case the curses are executed. Well, there's no possibility that God will fail what he promises, and there's no curses anyway. So these are all guaranteed by God's nature. If God is the only oath taker, then these are guaranteed to occur by God's nature. So this is what makes it promissory. There is no reciprocity. There's no requirement. God is granting this blessing in all of these 4 covenants. The Sinai Covenant, Israel is the oath taker. So this is called a Vassal covenant. This is the only covenant in the Bible where humans are taking the oath of the covenant. And the difference here, so a Vassal covenant, as we described, the way it would work out in the ancient Near East a lot is the army comes to your city, it surrounds your city, you're like, wow, that's a mighty big army. They knock at your door and they say, hello, I represent the army that is surrounding your city right now. Let's make a deal. We'll just go on our way and not take what we want if you give us tribute. And so if you give us tribute, we will protect you. If anybody else wants tribute, let us know. We'll take care of them. But you give us tribute, then we will provide you that protection, but we'll also leave your city standing. How's that sound as a deal? And then the covenant would be ratified with the blessing of protection in exchange for tribute, and then the curses, which are, and if we don't get our tribute, then our army will get bored and it will return and it will take what it wants and smash your city and salt the earth. So that those were the ways that the vassal covenants worked. This is like that. We're a stronger party called the suzerain. That's the word if you've ever heard that before. That's the counterpart to vassal, suzerain and vassal. The suzerain imposes the obligations of the oath on the vassal. And so that's what we have here in Exodus 19. Now the format for a vassal covenant, if you wanted to actually see it in writing, and I chose not to go into all the details here. If you're really interested, you can look up the book of Deuteronomy and the vassal covenant and see how that outline goes. But I actually think Exodus 19 does a fine job of following that outline pretty loosely. But you get the parties of the covenant named. Then you have a statement of the history between the two parties. Generally speaking, that statement of history includes why the vassal should obey. You see that in the historical documents, talking about the history and talking about just how terrific the suzerain has been to the vassal, and how much the vassal owes the suzerain. So then you have the oath. The lesser party, the vassal, pledges an oath of tribute, generally, to the stronger party, the suzerain. And then you finish with the blessings for obedience and the curses for disobedience. And the covenants are completely conditional on obedience. Unlike the promissory covenants that are not conditional, these are 100% as conditional as you can possibly get. And so if you look at Exodus 19, I'd say it overlays pretty well. So who are the parties? So I've abbreviated it here to put it on the slide, but if we want to read the whole thing, I could turn back one page. Okay, so starting in verse 3, so Moses went up to the mountain of God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain, "This is what you must say to the house of Jacob and explain to the Israelites." So he's identified the Israelites, so the sons of the house of Jacob and the Israelites. So these are the genetic direct descendants of Abraham. Not all of them, not the Ishmaelites, I guess, that we're talking the Israelites and the house of Jacob. And then the other party that's described in here is God. This is about God offering his commandment. If you obey me, you keep my covenant. Then next you have the history statement. So you've seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to me. So this is a statement here that goes back, why should you believe me? Why should you trust me? Why should you do anything for me, enter into a covenant with me? Well, you remember that whole slavery thing? Remember that whole, you were in captivity for like 400 years, and then I came down and eventually got you out, and then you were being chased by chariots, but the water went like that, and then you got through, and then it swallowed the chariots. You got to the other side. I brought you over to this mountain. I gave you food and like the manna and quail along the way, water from a rock. That was me. So that all that is summed up in this statement that I am trustworthy. I have kept my promises. I am powerful. I've delivered you from your enemies. All of that is baked into this statement. And so then there's the oath statement. And this is very summarized. This is just the highest level. Now, if you will obey me and carefully keep my covenant. The oath consists of the oath to do what it means to obey and to keep the covenant. So that needs further explication, and that does come later. You see this all through. So, what happens immediately after this is the giving of the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20. But even, through the latter half of Exodus, obviously Leviticus, Deuteronomy, even in Numbers, you find contingencies here, laws that they are supposed to follow to be in right relationship with God, to keep his covenant and obey. And then here, so you get the blessing statement, you don't get the full-on curses statement. So you see the curses in Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28, along with the blessings. So Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy 28 do a very good job of going through line itemizing the blessings and line itemizing the curses. But again, a summary statement here. If you obey and carefully keep my covenant, you will be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. You will be my kingdom of priests and my holy nation. So that is the format of this vassal covenant here. I, the stronger party, God, am offering a covenant with you, the house of Jacob, because of what I have done in bringing you out of Egypt. You can trust me. Obey me and keep my covenant, and you will be my treasured possession, my kingdom of priests and my holy nation. The thing to look for in here, and the thing that makes it really the vassal covenant, is the big if. That's the preposition if right there is the thing that makes this conditional. So what must they do? Obviously, obey and keep the covenant. Specifically, we're talking the Ten Commandments and the cleanliness, holiness, moral laws you find in Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy. Numbers could also be included in there. So it's obedience to the law. And what that law is, we get into more in the second video, but you see, be holy as I am holy, is a really good summary of what that law means and is getting at. And so then if they obey, like they do in the book of Joshua is a good time, the kinds of blessings that you see: plentiful harvest, there's peace in the land, they have, plentiful children. And then I would say the most important thing that comes from that, and it's the very last blessing, it's sort of the culmination of the blessings, and this is one of the most important creedal statements that you'll see in the 5 books of Moses, in the Torah. I would say this phrase, or this one, Leviticus 26:12, along with Exodus 34:6, we'll get to that one later, and then Deuteronomy 6:4 through 9, the Shema prayer. Those are the ones that you see repeated all throughout the New Testament. You see them repeated, dozens of times together. So this one here, Leviticus 26:12, the final of the blessings, I will walk among you and be your God, and you will be my people. That is a statement of the restoration of the relationship that they had in Eden. When was the last time that God actually walked among people? It was in Eden. There was a question as to whether or not that would ever come back. But if they are in right relationship, if they are following God's law, if they are obeying, then God will dwell among them, be their God, and they will be his people. If they don't, like in the book of Judges, where they repeatedly, quote, do evil in the sight of the Lord, end quote, you see the opposite. You see the poor harvest. You see war where they lose. Famine, the devastation of the nation of Israel. Where this is ultimately going to lead, God's presence is with them in obedience and is withdrawn in ultimate disobedience. So the final curse, the one that would break the covenant, remember, if the covenant curses are fully executed, we talked about this in the definition of covenant video, the covenant's over. What's going to fully end this covenantal relationship would be the withdrawal of God's presence, and I would argue the destruction of the temple. Now that's not in view for them here. They don't fully understand what that means, because the temple itself is also a contingency of the Davidic covenant. But you see that idea here, that God's presence with them means they're in right relationship. God withdrawing his presence and letting all the calamity come upon them, then they're in wrong relationship with God. A quick aside I want to make too. I mean, it's not a full-on aside, but I want to get on my soapbox for a second. I'm calling this slide the Old Testament God of Grace, because it irritates me that the God of the Old Testament is cast as some kind of angry bully. But if we understand what's happening here with the covenant, it starts to make sense. Like, you can follow God's actions and see how they make sense in the context of the covenant. So in a vassal covenant of any kind, any disobedience can invoke the covenant curses. It's not like, if you do, if you violate me 5 times, okay, then I can do some of the curses. No, that's not how it works. This is a solemn oath-bound pledge. and there are curses for disobedience. Remember in the definition of the covenant video, we talked about disobedience. If they break the oath, then they will suffer the wrath of God. So this is actually God saying you will suffer the wrath of God if you break the covenant. God had every right to end the covenant right then and there with the making of the golden calf. Full-on covenant curses were done. And you could see that God actually was kind of thinking about it. When you read through Exodus after the ratification ceremony in Exodus 24, you can see that God and Israel kind of got off on icy terms to start the covenant. There were a few times where it was very clear that this newly adopted child, Israel, needed some discipline. But when God gives his autobiographical statement in Exodus 34, this is right after the golden calf has taken place. He describes himself as slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. And so when you look at all the disobedience that occurs, that happens in Exodus, you can look at the disobedience that happens in Numbers with the spies that are sent out. You can look at the book of Judges is just wrought with it. The monarchy, Saul, the entire northern kingdom, all the kings in the northern kingdom. Here's the shortcut, all bad. And yet, the full covenant curses didn't come on until the destruction of the temple. God is incredibly patient. God is slow to anger. God is responding to their repentance throughout and giving them an extra chance, despite the fact that the arrangement that, by the way, they agreed to, which is going to be the next slide, and I thought that was what was going to pop up, so I clicked. They agreed to these terms. God is stopping far short of what he is within his right to do and what the Israelites have agreed is within his right to do in dealing with them and their disobedience. God also was not enforcing these rules on the other nations. This was a covenant between him and Israel. These laws were part of the covenant between him and Israel. This is about a relationship between God and Israel. This is different than the New Covenant. This is different than the Abrahamic Covenant, where those two are very specifically part of every person, or all kinds of people, every tribe, tongue, people, and nation, all peoples of the earth. This one has a very specific contractual kind of feel to it, where Israel swore the oath. We are not ethnic Israel. We are not the ones who swore the oath here, but they swore the oath knowing full well what they were getting into. So anyway, after the temple was destroyed, the presence of Yahweh didn't return to the temple when it was rebuilt. And because Yahweh's presence with them was the sign of obedience, they thought it's because they weren't following the law well enough. So if you ever wondered why the Pharisees are so cranky about the Sabbath, a lot of them were thinking, gosh, if we could just get this right, then we would be back in right relationship with God. God's presence would return to the temple like it did before, like it was before, and we would be back in our covenant relationship with God. But that isn't what happened. Instead, God came in a totally different way than they were expecting. And I need to say this right now too. Don't miss this. Exodus 19:8, then all the people responded together, we will do all that the Lord has spoken. In the covenant ratification ceremony, we're going to go over this a little bit later too. Moses took the covenant scroll, read it aloud to the people. They responded, we will do and obey everything the Lord has commanded. They knew full well what they were getting into. The scroll of the law was read to them. This is actually not just in verse 7, but in verse 3. And I'm going to hit this point again because I don't want anybody who watches this video to walk away not remembering this. Israel agreed to this covenant. It's not like God came down and said, hi, everybody, welcome to Mount Sinai. Here are the rules for all humans at all time for your moral law. And if you don't live up to this, then I will smite thee. It's not at all what's going on here. This was an agreement between Israel and God. They knew what the stipulations of the covenant were going to be, and they agreed in principle at the beginning, and they had the whole scroll of the covenant read to them, and they agreed again. And then they went to the animal sacrifices, and right at the last moment, they agreed again, and then they fully entered into the covenant. So this is an agreed to covenant where Israel swore an oath, a solemn oath, and basically said, just like with the Abrahamic covenant, if we break our oath, then let what has happened to these animals happen to us. Let that sink in when you think about the way that God is dealing with Israel. Remember the solemn oath that they swore. So, yes, God didn't unilaterally impose the law. Israel agreed to it. So another thing I want to mention too about the Sinai Covenant, so is the Sinai Covenant works salvation then? So, Christians, especially in the evangelical circles, the words work salvation are some of the worst possible words that could ever be combined together. It's a curse word. And so the question here, is the Sinai Covenant work salvation? I want to stop here for a moment and address this because I think there tends to be a little bit of a misunderstanding out there about what's going on at Sinai. Let's go again and look at the promise. What's being offered here in Exodus 19? You will be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. You will be my kingdom of priests and my holy nation. That's the offer. That's the blessing that's associated with the covenant. That God walking with them, the material blessings right there, right now, are what's part of the covenant. What's conspicuously absent, if we think in the context of work salvation, is, and if you obey me and keep my covenant, then you will be morally sufficient to enter into my presence and live in heaven and paradise with me forever, and your sins won't count because you won't have any of them because you'll have been morally perfect. The idea, salvation in the sense of dealing with sin so that Israel can get to heaven, is not what's going on here. And this isn't just me saying this. If there's any who are watching who are skeptical, every resource I consulted on this said the same thing. John Piper said the same thing. This is not about sort of conditional election into God's family, in a salvific sense. Remember, and this is why I spent a lot of the time on the Passover earlier, Israel was unconditionally elected before they even left Israel. I'm sorry, I did that again. Before they even left Egypt. They were chosen because they were offspring of Abraham. The covenant membership here, as part of the Abrahamic covenant, is not in question. The Sinai covenant is dealing with their status as the treasured possession, the kingdom of priests, and the holy nation. That's what's in view here. And so let's break that down. What's going on? What is actually being promised? What do they lose out on if they don't obey? What do they get if they obey? So the treasured possession. We kind of understand what this is. Status is elevated above the other nations. This is why, in the text there, 19:5, although all the earth is mine, so you will be my treasured possession, or my own possession out of all the peoples, even though all the earth is mine. God is saying, there are people everywhere. I own all of this, and so everything is my possession, but you will be my special possession. The way I think about it is, my daughter's, her treasured possession is her stuffed flying squirrel, Matilda. Matilda is more important than anything else. You can give her whatever toys you want, and she will not nap. If you give her Matilda, she will nap. If we would leave Matilda behind, we must go get Matilda. We can leave Sophie behind and it doesn't matter. Nobody will even notice. Matilda has a status that is above the other toys. So Israel is going to have a status above the other nations. They're going to be blessed in excess of the other nations. God is going to favor them more than the other nations. God is offering to play favorites with Israel. That's what he's offering here. The holy nation. So set apart for a purpose. The idea of holy, separate, different. consecrated might be another way of thinking about it. I mean, it goes along with being the treasured possession. They are not only just elevated, but they are to be holy. They are to be more like God than the other nations. One of the things that sets them apart in this culture for sure is the monotheism. If you watch the Guidelines for Interpretation video, where we go over the question of can you wear a 50-50 shirt, and the idea behind, what the heck is this law doing there? Can Christians wear 50-50 shirts? Why is this there? It was a law to make them separate. It was to make them look different. If they were going to believe in one God and all the pagans were going to believe in multiple gods, their garb would be one cloth, their fields would be one crop. You would see this theme throughout their lives that there was one God, and they would order their lives differently because of that. This is also, that would be holy nation. So Israel as a nation has this calling. This is why the covenant was not enforced on other nations. They are not parties of the covenant. So God didn't say, these are the laws for all humans, and if you find anyone who disobeys it, go and do whatever this book says you should do to the people who disobey the law. It's not how it went. We'll talk about the command to drive out the Canaanites in a future video. But the law was not part of the arrangement with every person who lived at that time. It's for the parties of the covenant, which would be Israel. So Israel would be not common. There would be the treasured possession, the holy nation. They would be elevated above in status. Obviously, they're not God. There's something in between. And there's a word for that. And the word for that happens to be a priest. A priest means mediator or an intermediary. Typically, in a religious context, a priest is one who performs religious acts on behalf of others. You can think about this. So Roman Catholicism, the word priest is probably exactly the right way to describe the way that Roman Catholic clerics function. They are alter Christus in their understanding. So they are a representative of Christ, and they dispense the grace of the covenant through the sacraments. So, for instance, for forgiveness in Roman Catholicism, you must go see a priest and receive absolution from the priest. God's forgiveness is there for the taking, but you can't do that on your own. You must go through the intermediary. You must go through a priest. An Israelite religion had the same kind of caste of folks, the Levites. So the priests were holy, and they were the ones who did the sacrificial system. You would bring your sacrifices to the Levites. The Levites were the ones that would run the temple. The high priest was the one that got to go into the Holy of Holies, the very center of the temple where the presence of God was. And, it even says it in there. So no one is to enter the Lord's temple, but the priests and Levites who serve. They may enter because they are holy. So the priests are the representatives, the intermediaries, the ones who are reflecting God back to the people in a way, the ones that you would go through to gain access to God. And then kingdom is royal. The terms really here, I actually thought about this as I was doing the preparation for this. Kingdom and priest, just as a concept, feels weird to us. Especially, in the United States, in the West, we have a separation of church and state. The kings go over here, the priests go over here. A kingdom of priests smells like that icky word theocracy. There's not really any doubt that Israel functioned very much like that. But a kingdom of priests is a royal vocation, a ruling vocation of the mediators of God. So to give an illustration, so where else do we see this? Genesis 1. So human beings are made in the image of God. So they're not common creation. They're not God. There's something in between. They're told to be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and every creature that crawls on the earth. Rule and subdue, and we talked about this in the creation video, these are words to describe the call of ancient Near Eastern kings. This is the call to be the ones that are in charge, that are running the world, so to speak. And so if you ever wonder why Adam gets to name the animals, remember, God names everything up through the creation of Adam. And then God brings the animals to Adam, and Adam gets to name them. Why? Because Adam is God's mediator. Adam has the call, the royal call, as the intermediary, the one that's in the image of God. So it's not God, but he's in God's image. So the image of the king, the image of the God in the temple, saying this God is in charge. And he's given a vocation to subdue and rule over the earth. So he is allowed to be in the stead of God in these cases. So that what's interesting here is that human beings are created. It is in the created order for us to be God's priests. Let's let that sink in. We humans were made to be the administrators of God's grace here on earth. We went over this in the creation video too. We have a purpose. We weren't made to be saved. It's not like, God is, I've heard it said before, God made us to glorify himself in the redemption of a particular people. I believe God is glorified in the redemption of a particular people, but I don't think that we were made for the purpose of falling so we could be redeemed. If that was the case, then, it would make sense that, yes, God is glorified in that. I just don't think it's a complete answer. I think it ignores the vocational aspect of humanity. I think it ignores what is being said in Genesis about the role of human beings, that we were made to be the priests. We were made to be the ones who are the intermediaries between God and the creation. We lost that, and then God is glorified in our redemption, absolutely. And all creation ultimately exists to glorify God because we are in his temple. This whole creation, the whole world, the whole universe is the temple of God. But let's think of our vocation as primarily priestly, because I think that's how the text describes it. Psalm 8, I think it just sets it up super clear. So Psalm 8, this is the middle of the psalm, but what are mere mortals that you should think about them? Human beings, you should care for them. Remember what comes before this, when I look at the stars, the work of your hands. So you look at the vastness of the universe. What are we mortals that you should think about us, or humans that you should care about us? Yet you made them only a little lower than God and crowned them with glory and honor. You gave them charge of everything you made, putting all things under their authority. So again, we see this treasured possession idea, only a little lower than God, crown them with glory and honor. There's your royal. You gave them charge of everything you made, putting all things under their authority. This is the representatives. This is the priestly idea. This is, the psalmist basically describing the treasured possession and the kingdom of priests right here, that this is a human idea. This is what human beings are made to be. We lost this in the fall. And so now Israel is being offered the reestablishment of that purpose for human existence. So we're created to be royal priests. We're made to be the priests in Eden. We lost it in the fall. So the vocation and the relationship with God need to be restored. It wasn't really clear how that was going to happen. And then it was promised to Abraham, your offspring are going to be the ones through whom this returns to the world. And then now Israel, so Abraham's offspring, received the offer to be what humans were made to be in order to be the ones to make the world right again. So that's kind of how this is progressing through the story. So Israel's covenant offer here isn't related to heaven and salvation or anything like that. It's related to the Abrahamic promise of the blessing returning to earth and the redemption of the human vocation to be God's kingdom of priests. And that's the catch here on this one. it is made contingent. Is made contingent on obedience. Israel has the opportunity, but they must obey in order to fully execute that call. So, Exodus 24 now. If we move to Exodus 24, so this is where you see the covenant ratification ceremony. So, when there's a covenant ratification ceremony, you have the declaration of the reading of the terms of the covenant. You have the taking of the oath. You have the animal sacrifice. And again, we've covered this many times now, but let what happened to the animals happen to the one who breaks the oath. And then a covenant banquet. So this is, historically kind of the format that it would go in. And the reason I go over this is just to take us through Exodus 24 and the covenant ratification. So, reading of the terms of the covenant, Moses came and told the people all the commands and ordinances. So all the commands and ordinances are read to the people before the covenant ratification. I said I was going to go over this and hit it again. This is not a unilaterally imposed law. This is something that they knew full well. They had every little, jot and tittle read to them. And then all the people responded with a single voice, we will do everything that the Lord has commanded. Okay, so then, after that happens in Exodus 24, Moses wrote down the words of the Lord. He rose early the next morning. They set up the 12 pillars for the 12 tribes of Israel. They go get animals for the offerings. And then again, Moses took the covenant scroll and read it aloud to the people. And they responded, we will do and obey everything that the Lord has commanded. So this has happened 3 times now, actually, where they are told the terms of the covenant and they say, we will obey. Told the terms of the covenant, we'll still obey. Told the terms of the covenant, we're still saying we're going to obey. So this covenant was entered into voluntarily by Israel in full knowledge of what it was going to entail. There's never any assumption the law applied to non-Israelites. I've said that multiple times now. The covenant is between 2 named parties, nobody else. So the law was not for the Gentiles, not for the Canaanites. This was not something imposed on them. They agreed to it voluntarily. They knew full well what it was, and it wasn't a salvation issue either. They'd already been chosen. It was about their status, restoring the relationship of priesthood. The human vocation, the human calling. They were the ones who had the offer to be fully human again. And then they could bring that to the whole world. So then the animal sacrifice. So you have the 12 pillars for the 12 tribes of Israel. They offered burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. I thought I'd go over this real quick. So a burnt offering, the whole offering is consumed in flame. This is solely for God. It's an act of worship to take something and say, we're going to offer this. They built an altar for the sake of the sacrifices, and then on the altar, the sacrifice is consumed. Fellowship offering is a free gift. It's of thanksgiving. So fellowship offerings are not something that's commanded. They're given freely, and it's shared. So some of it is burnt. Some of it was for the priests, and some of it was consumed by the people who offered the sacrifice as well. So they offered both burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. Burnt offering, a full-on sacrifice, and then fellowship, a friendship thanksgiving offering. And then the blood is then used for the ratification of the covenant. It's sprinkled on the Israelites at the altar, signifying the 2 parties of the covenant. So the altar represents God, and the Israelites represent the Israelites, and they seal the covenant in blood. And this is what, at this point, the covenant is now in effect. Covenants are, again, deadly serious. The blood is symbolic of the seriousness of the covenant. Let what has happened to these animals happen to the oath breaker. So they took the oath. When they said, we will do what the Lord has said, after knowing full well what the terms were, that's the oath. And then the 2 parties present that get the blood, God and the Israelites. So those are your 2 named parties. The oath is taken after the ordinances are read. And then the blessings and the curses come later. They're written down in Leviticus and Deuteronomy among the things that are read to the people. And then Moses went up with Aaron, Nahadab, and Abihu, and 70 of Israel's elders, and they saw the God of Israel. Beneath his feet was something like a pavement made of sapphire stone, as clear as the sky itself. God did not harm the Israelite nobles. They saw him, and they ate and drank. Likely one of those things that, if you've read through the Bible before, you're just like, yeah, that's interesting. Okay, something happened. We'll go into the next one. I want to highlight this because here you see the covenant meal. Covenant ratifications were normally concluded with a covenant meal between the parties. This one is no different. And so when they ate and drank, they are celebrating the ratification of the covenant. When it says God did not harm the Israelite nobles, they saw him, they ate and drank. So there's a widespread belief in the ancient Near East that to see God would cause death. The Bible says this as well. Moses says, "Let me see your face. No one can see my face and live." Now, we also saw that some aspect of God, through the rock, you can see my hindquarters. Some aspect of God can be beheld and not cause death. So even though it explicitly says no one can see my face and live, it doesn't mean that you can't see any part of God. And indeed, the Shekinah glory itself is a physical manifestation of the presence of God. But Moses hides his face. Generally speaking, they did not ever want to lay their eyes on God. To see him and then eat and drink in this way would be extraordinarily jarring to somebody at that time, because that is not what you did with the gods. That is not how things went. It was almost as if you were being elevated to that status, or God condescended to your status in order to engage with you on that level. But that's what happened here. So in what sense did they actually see the God of Israel? The text says they did. We don't know how. My advice here, don't worry too much about this. We know that it's possible to happen in some sense, but we're on the fringe of the explicable as it stands. It's the same thing with the sapphire pavement. What is this? Does that mean that heaven is, paved with sapphires? I wouldn't build a theology on that. It does honestly sound like three-tiered universe language again. Sort of you're walking on the waters above. But I don't know. I would grasp here that the point is the covenant meal, that they've just sealed a covenant with God, and that's why that is included in this passage. And not worry too much about the metaphysics of seeing God or the Sapphire Road. It's in terms of God's story, those things there are closer to questions about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin than it is about truly understanding the story that's being told. Okay, so the sign of the covenant here. One quick second. All right. The light was getting very close to the camera. All right. So the sign of the covenant now. Tell the Israelites, you must observe my Sabbaths, for it is a sign between me and you through your generations, so that you will know that I am Yahweh who sets you apart. Exodus 31:13, and then right afterwards, if anyone does work on it, that is the Sabbath, that person must be cut off from his people. Work may be done for 6 days, but on the seventh day there must be a Sabbath of complete rest. Anyone who does work on the Sabbath must be put to death. Okay. So the sign of the covenant is the Sabbath. You must observe my Sabbaths, for it is a sign between me and you through your generations. Means stoppage or cessation. It's the stopping day. And did this, whole concept come out of nowhere? Why a Sabbath? Well, here in Exodus 31 is not the first time you see a Sabbath. Sabbath is mentioned first. It's rooted in creation. In Exodus chapter 20, remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy. For remember, in 6 days the Lord your God created, the earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and the seventh day he rested. So you could say in Genesis you see a Sabbath. In Exodus 16:22 through 29, the search for manna. So manna and quail were being given in the desert, and the people would go out and they would gather it up, and then they would continue to go gather day in, day out, and then on the Sabbath they were told, no, you're not going to do that on the Sabbath. This is, a day of rest. And then the commandment is given, which they have agreed to now. But even in the commandments, this was something that they agreed to. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. The rationale that the text gives is that this is a covenant sign. So if we want to think about what the purpose of the Sabbath is, God is not saying that the purpose of the Sabbath is you need rest, so if you don't, you should be put to death. God didn't strike the manna gatherers dead in Exodus 16. The penalty of death was introduced as part of the covenant. So working on the Sabbath pre-covenant was something, God was like, guys, no, don't do that. They were given a stern rebuke in Exodus 16. They were told to stop, but the command wasn't, now go strike them dead. That's not what happens, even though that's what it says in Exodus 31. Why? The penalty of death is introduced as part of the covenant. This is a marker of covenant faithfulness to God under Sinai. The sign of a covenant is one of those ways that the oath giver, the humans, the Israelites, the oath givers, continually reaffirm on a regular basis their commitment to the covenant. If they don't keep the Sabbath, then they are not demonstrating the sign of the covenant back to God. It's included in what was agreed to in the Sinai Covenant. So to break the Sabbath was to break the Sinai Covenant and to allow the curses of the covenant to be brought to bear on the lawbreaker. So this is, if we think about it in terms of covenant violation, and then, okay, if you violate one of these covenants, what can happen? Well, curses of the covenant can happen. What are those curses? Well, the curses will be brought to bear on the lawbreaker for the Sabbath, and that is death. So when we look at the Sabbath this way, we understand its covenantal context. We can understand now why, why is it that God seems so cranky about people working in the Sabbath? He's cranky about keeping the covenant, the thing that they solemnly pledged themselves to do, the way they solemnly pledged themselves to him and their loyalty to him. To not do this was to say, we are no longer going to uphold our side of the bargain. And that wasn't going to be acceptable. So this was sort of a constant renewal of their vow, so to speak. So imagine, let's say it was a contingency of your marriage that you were going to renew your vows once a week. I don't think anybody's ever done that, but we'll use this analogy anyway. Then one of you just doesn't show up. So you're saying, if you agreed that our marriage is going to consist of a renewal of our vows once per week, or even if you promised even once a year, yes, we will renew our vows once a year, and then you leave your spouse at the altar and even say, no, I'm not renewing my vows, what's that going to signal about the covenant? It's going to signal a very serious departure on your part from the idea of the covenant. It's the same thing for Israel. So you could be reductionist and say, so if you're not in the right place at the right time on that day to renew your vows, it's over. But that's not what it means. It means that you're refusing to renew your vows. And in the same way here, if Israel is working on the Sabbath, then they are refusing to acknowledge the solemn covenant that they made. So that does lead us to an interesting question. Must Christians observe the Sabbath? Remember, so if this is the sign of the Sinai Covenant, it's between God and the Israelites. And just like the non-Israelites were not expected to follow the law because they weren't covenant members, the Sabbath was not required for non-covenant members, non-Israelites either. We are not Israelites. We've inherited the vocation of Israel, but we are not the house of Jacob as Christians. And then what does the New Testament say? I mean, heck, it's a good question. Let's ask the New Testament. So Colossians chapter 2. Do not let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink, or with regard to a religious festival, or a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day. These are a shadow of the things to come. The reality is in Christ. Romans 15:5. One considers one day more sacred than another. Another person considers every day alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. And then, of course, Jesus, the Sabbath is made for man and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. New Testament on multiple occasions. Especially, I would say, in Romans and Colossians. And, Jesus too, for that matter, had the opportunity to say, my disciples or the disciples of Christ will continue to observe the Sabbath. It doesn't say that. It actually goes out of its way to say, in Colossians, these are a shadow of the things to come. He's kind of saying, don't worry about that. Romans 14. Some people say one day, others consider every day alike. What could he have said? But I tell you that the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy, and we will continue to observe that. Could have said that. It's not what he said. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. Jesus could have, given further explanation of what this means. The Sabbath law is not something that Christians have to observe. Sabbath keeping as moral law under pain of execution is just not how Christians are in a covenant relationship with God right now. As part of the Sinai Covenant, when the New Testament was given multiple opportunities to reiterate the moral imperative of the Sabbath, the New Testament does not do so. Nowhere in the New Testament, nowhere is one's salvation or covenant membership predicated on Sabbath observance. It's not in there. However, the Sabbath is made for man. That's what Jesus said. So if God made something for us, why neglect it? It's a day of rest for our benefit. It's not a rule with an or else attached to it, but it would be best if we take time out and say, you know what, we need to stop, rest, devote ourselves to God. If that was the way that God made something for us and is trying to signal to us, you have to rest. You are not made. I did not make you to not rest. Then we should continue to observe that for our own benefit. But it's for our own benefit. And you know what? If you happen to work a 7-day week sometime, you're not going to hell. How about that? So, a couple more things to get through. Exodus 34:6. So we talked about Leviticus 26:12 as one of those really important creedal statements. I will walk with you and be your God, and you will be my people. It's one of those that's repeated often. Here's another one. Then the Lord passed in front of Moses and said, Yahweh, Yahweh, compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger and rich in faithful love and truth. This statement right here, this is from the word of the Lord, the mouth of the Lord, about himself, referring to himself in the third person, which is actually very rare. I don't know if it happens anywhere else, to be totally honest with you. And this self-characterization of God was one of the things that stuck with Israel. They repeated it all over the place. They repeated it in Numbers, 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles, Nehemiah, all through the Psalms, Joel, Jonah. And so it repeated almost a dozen times. So it's not Yahweh, Yahweh, the impatient and wrathful God. This is Yahweh who is compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, rich in steadfast loving kindness and truth. This is played out in the history of Israel with how patient God is. God describes himself this way, and I think we see God actually play it out that way as well. Okay. So, Exodus chapter 40. This is what it's all building to. So I call it, the guest of honor arrives. So let's recap. They're still at Sinai at this point in the narrative. A lot has happened. I know this is Exodus 40. It started with Exodus 19. They're still at Sinai. They actually stay at Sinai for a year. And so this part right here, they're at Sinai. This cloud, they've been going up to see. Cloud's been speaking to them. Still up there on that mountain. So God's presence, God's dramatic presence has been up on the mountain. They've been going up and come down. Well, Moses is going up and down and up and down and up and down. Sometimes the elders and the priests are with him, sometimes not. The Bible has taken a significant amount of time between, say, like Exodus, I think it's like Exodus 35 through 40, describing the construction of the tabernacle. And everything that goes into that, the meticulous care that goes into that. And just a brief aside that I can't get into, but if God cares so much about the intricacies of the tabernacle and the ark and the Holy of Holies, he cares a lot about the aesthetic of worship. It's not just anything goes. But anyway, that is an aside. Exodus 40:33. So right before this, it all culminates there in, so Moses finished the work. So everything that it keeps talking about with, it must have, this much gold on it. It must be made of this. It must be embroidered this. You have to have this kind of needlework, this kind of yarn. It needs to be topaz and emerald and turquoise and diamond and all of that. Moses finished the work. So now there's a paragraph break here. This is, and the paragraph break is in there in the Jewish text too. So the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses was unable to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud rested on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. The Israelites set out whenever the cloud was taken up from the tabernacle throughout the stage of their journey. The cloud was not taken up, they did not set out until the day it was taken up. For the cloud of the Lord was over the tabernacle by day, and there was a fire inside the cloud by night, visible to the entire house of Israel through all the stages of their journey. The word of the Lord. So, Moses finishes his work, and then the cloud comes down off Sinai, and it covers the tabernacle, the tent of meeting. The glory of the Lord fills that place. So, this is how Exodus ends. The entire book is aiming toward this. For the first time since Eden, God is now dwelling with humanity again. That if I had to summarize what Exodus is about, I would say God rescuing his chosen people and then making their relationship with him right again conditionally. But God is now dwelling with humanity again. His people have entered into the covenant with him. They are his kingdom of priests. They're the vessel through which his blessing will return to the world, like he told Abraham they would be. All of this is important just to see the continuous narrative of the Bible. As I said at the very beginning, the Bible is a story. It is one story. It is God's story. It is history. And this is what's happening in that story up to this point. This is how far we've gotten in the plot. And so I think it's important to realize, where did we end up? What's the point of everything in Exodus? It's to get here. God's dramatic presence, the Shekinah glory, is seen throughout Scripture, actually, in this way, is the cloud or smoke or fire. So you see in Genesis 15 in the covenant ratification, the burning bush, the cloud at Sinai, starting in Exodus 16. 2 Chronicles 7, the dedication of Solomon's temple, which is the new tabernacle, the new tent of meeting. All of that, goes into the temple. Isaiah 6, his vision of the temple throne room, God's throne room. Luke 9 in the Transfiguration, when the cloud descends and the voice comes from the cloud, they knew what that was. So this whole idiom here with the cloud, it is the presence of God, and it is the presence of God now among his people. I'm sure there are more examples than this. This is just what I could remember off the top of my head. So now the book of Exodus has ended. God is dwelling with humanity again, and he has his royal priesthood back on condition of their obedience. So that's all for now. The next video is going to go more into the law. We're going to open it up and talk about the law itself. We're going to ask some of the tough questions. Anyway, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.